I'm going to show you a boring Angular application that I built with NX. It's this one right here that I created to do some boring tax calculations for me. Now the basic idea is that I upload a CSV of my Gumroad data, which is the platform I'm using to sell my books and things like that. I add another CSV of the USD to AUD exchange rates for each day. I select a financial quarter, and then it converts all of the sales amounts from USD to AUD using the exchange rate from the day of the sale and spits out some totals for me, as well as a report that I can download and another CSV that I can import into my accounting software. Now that's not exactly a fun example you are likely to see on a YouTube tutorial, but it is a real world project that I architected following NX best practices, and we're going to see what that looks like. So what I have here is an NX workspace that I've created for my personal apps. So all those little apps I use for just personal things, like this little tax calculation one. And it might seem like overkill using NX and architecting little personal tools as if I'm building it for a Fortune 500 company, but I actually don't think this approach is overkill at all, and I think it makes it easier to code and maintain these applications. I think these little personal projects that nobody else is ever going to see are the exact types of projects that are more likely to get a bit messy, get a bit unorganized, and just become a nightmare to maintain. So I'm going to quickly summarize why I think this approach is a good idea for personal apps, and then we are going to look at how I've gone about structuring this particular tax application within the NX workspace. So there's a lot here that I like, so I'm going to quickly try to blast through my entire list as quickly as I can. So this app is more complex than it might seem on the surface, and if I just try to smash this thing out with poor architecture in one or two mega components or services, it is going to get messy, it's going to get buggy, and I'm going to hate working on it. Especially when I come back to it in 1 to 2 years, because I need to modify how the CSV import works. Using NX and following best practices just helps you think about how to go about structuring the app in the best way. It's kind of like having guardrails up that are going to keep you on the right path. And all of the usual NX benefits will apply. I have nice build and testing tools, lots of generators I can utilize, and if I'm following best practices by building functionality into libraries, I will be able to easily reuse a lot of my work in other apps I build. The CSV parsing and download functionality, for example, is something I will make use of in other apps. It increases my incentive to create better quality software for myself. If I'm building libraries that I'm likely to reuse again for other projects, I have more incentive to create a suite of high quality libraries for myself. If I was just coding this one tax application and I was never going to use the code for anything else, I'm much more likely to just build some crappy code that works but is really, ugly and not nice to maintain. And a lot of the time, code that you take shortcuts on because it's just throwaway code, you end up maintaining for years and it just causes you a lot of hassle. And finally, I don't think it is even slower to build this way once you get the patterns down. In fact, I find coding this way to be a lot calmer. Everything is logical and structured, like having everything in your cupboards neatly organized and labeled. You don't need to dedicate brain power trying to keep track of what's going on in your app. Okay, with my little NX love note out of the way, let's get into actually looking at how this application is structured. Now, I already have a video that talks about the basic structure I am using here, and that is applications that are just lightweight shells and libraries that are split up into features, data access, UI, and utilities that contain almost all of the functionality that these lightweight shells use. So we are going to be taking a look at all of this, but I won't be able to spend too long talking about the basics of this approach. So if you are unfamiliar with the structure, I would recommend watching that video first. I'll link to that in the description. And this structure is also heavily inspired by the Angular Spotify project by Trung, so definitely check that out as well. Okay, so let's start by looking at the application shell. So this is just a stock standard Angular application, except I have also added Tailwind to the project. So all we have here is this root component, And the root component has the responsibility of importing the shell module from one of our libraries. So there is almost nothing in the actual application itself that we have actually coded. It is just pulling it in from our library. And just a quick note here, the workspace I have created is called personal. So that's why you'll see personal used quite a lot as a prefix throughout the app. And the application is called BAS, B-A-S, just because that is the name of what Australian businesses have to file each quarter, a business activity statement. So you're going to see stuff like this as well, BAS shell module. And you can see on the left here, I have another app here called Crypto. And so for that one, I would have something like Crypto shell module here that is also being imported from our libraries. So let's just keep pulling on this thread to reveal more of the structure. So we're going to look at this shell module now. So this module, as you'll see over in the left here, lives inside of our libraries folder. Specifically, it is under the BAS grouping folder. And so this BAS grouping folder is where everything that is specific to this one app will live. And inside of that folder, we have a few more folders, including our shell grouping folder, which then defines the actual shell module as a feature library. Now again, if this is all sounding weird to you, make sure to check out the other video for a more thorough explanation of this structure. So the main purpose of the shell module is to set up the layout that will contain the rest of the app and the routes. And if we open up the routes that are being used here, you can see in the routes that we pass in the layout component. And so the layout component is also inside of this same grouping folder. It's just under the UI folder instead. And this folder contains two more libraries, one for the layout component and one for the main view component. Now the layout component just contains a wrapper for the app, and inside of that we have the main view component, which contains our main router outlet. So if we open up the main view library, we'll open up that component, and you can see we just have a router outlet in there. So this is a basic sort of structure you might use to set up routing in any type of application really. And then once we have this basic structure, we can start adding new components and routes to actually build out the functionality. So this application just contains one default route, which is the home component. And again, as you can see, this is being imported from one of our libraries. So if we expand out the library folder, we'll go into BAS. We see we have our home grouping folder. And then again, inside of that, we have our feature library, UI, and util. So the feature library implements the home component itself, because that's where our smart components will live as feature libraries. We have the UI folder that contains libraries for each UI component, which will just be the simple presentational components. And then we have our util folder for just our little helpers, helper functions, things like that. And what is not currently included is a data access folder, because we don't actually need that for our home component in this case. So to reiterate, the idea here is that we want our home component to be our smart component, which is why it lives in the feature library. And it's smart because it handles things like coordinating all the complex logic, injecting dependencies, and things like that. And then as much as possible, we want to utilize dumb or presentational components that primarily communicate through their inputs and outputs. So they don't really have a view of what's going on in the grander scheme of things. They just get something given to them, they do something, they give some data back, and that's about it. So if we open the template for our homepage component, we'll see that it is primarily made up of other components, our dumb UI components. And we are passing inputs to those components. And if we take a look at the class for our home component, we can see that in the ng-on init here, we are reacting to data changes from those components. And so what we're basically doing here is reacting to that data, and we're calling utility functions that we have defined in our utils to handle the complex logic or passing CSVs and things like that. So that's all not clogging up this component. So after reacting to that data coming in from those child dumb UI components, We're calling the necessary utilities we need, and then the home component is setting up, in this case, a stream that is being used by some other component so that the other component has the input data that it needs to do its job. So you can see the home component is kind of orchestrating everything here, and the other dumb UI components don't really have any sense of what is happening on a grander scale. They just get their inputs and they give back data in some way, or they just display that data. And that's what makes the home component a smart component, because it's doing all of this sort of complex logic, it's orchestrating things. And in this case, we're not actually injecting any dependencies, but that would be the role of a smart component also. Okay, so now let's take a look at those presentational UI components and also the utility functions as well. So first, the UI components, we have two in this case. We have a component to handle the CSV uploads and another to display the summarized results. So if we open these up and just take a quick look at both of them, you'll see that they are quite a lot simpler than our home component. We just have some basic inputs, and the majority of what is going on in the templates is just related to presenting this data. We're just displaying something on the screen. We're not doing anything fancy anywhere. And what we're doing in the case of this data upload component here is that we are getting data out of this component by allowing a form control to be passed in as an input. So if we just quickly jump back into the parent component here, you can see that we're setting up those controls that we are passing as input to that presentational component. And then we are able to listen for changes on those controls using the value changes observable to then react to what is happening in that component. So in this case, this is just a nice little way to be able to reactively respond to changes in this component. And then finally, we have the files in our utility library, which are probably just about what you would expect. We just have some exported functions that handle manipulating objects and arrays and returning the values that we need. And the only thing left in these BAS specific libraries that we haven't covered yet is the shared data access here. So we just have a models library here that just contains things like the TypeScript interfaces and types that we are using. And then these can just be imported wherever we need it. So that is the library specific to the BAS application. But now we get into the part where NX really shines, and that is in the shared libraries. And so these are the libraries that we are intending to be generic and usable by any application in this workspace, not just the BAS app. So not everything will be able to be generic enough to be reusable in other circumstances, but there are often many opportunities to do this. So in this case, I have moved any UI components that could be used generically into this shared UI folder. So this includes the buttons I was using, the data cards to display the totals, and the file input for uploading CSVs. So if we just take a look at the button, for example, you can just see this is actually just a directive that I can attach to a button element, and that is going to handle styling it with Tailwind for me. So rather than continually needing to define the styles for a button, I can just use this in any application that I create in this workspace, and I can supply some additional inputs to it to define what I want it to look like. So in this case, I just have the ability to have a normal width or a full width button, and I can also change the color to some predefined colors. So this is pretty basic right now and just satisfies what I needed for this one particular application. But as I add more apps and I work on this more, I can come back to this component and extend it with new functionality that I need. And the benefit of that is that every application that is using it will also benefit from those updates. So the cool thing about this is that as you build more and more and you add apps to this workspace that you're continually working on maybe for years, you build up your own little personal library of reusable components, directives, services, and utilities. And the longer you go about doing this, the more apparent it's going to be that using something like NX and following best practices and structuring things in this way, you'll see how important that is, because otherwise things will quickly become a mess that is hard to manage, hard to maintain, and you're just going to have a bad time, as opposed to structuring something like this, where working on it actually feels good and you feel like you sort of have control of everything that is going on. And as well as the shared UI that I've created here, I also have 2 generic utilities that I have added. So we have a file reader and parse CSV to parse CSV files. The file reader here, for example, just allows us to use file reader as an observable. So it's basically just wrapping that up for us and just makes it more convenient for us to use in an RxJS environment. And I haven't touched on that too much in this video, but that is generally the way I enjoy coding, is reactively with streams, declaratively. So doing something like this that I can then reuse in any app ever that I create where I want to read a file is very convenient. So there was quite a lot to cover here, and I didn't get to everything, but I mostly just wanted to give you a real world example of what building out an application with NX and adhering to best practices might look like. And I get that a lot of this probably looks quite confusing and intimidating if you are new to NX or if you are new to this library approach. But when you take it slowly, step by step, it is easier to wrap your head around. And when you do, you'll be creating libraries like there is no tomorrow and loving every minute of it. All right, that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.